Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Chemistry, Chapter 9, and we are on 9.3, the properties of solutions. So one property of solutions is that higher concentrations have faster reaction rates. So if you're doing a chemical reaction and you have more of the chemical in like an aqueous solution, then the chemicals are going to bump into each other more often, and then that reaction rate is going to be faster. So let's say a 2 molar solution, the chemical reaction will happen faster than if you have a 1 molar solution. Another property is that higher temperatures have faster reactions. And you know this because we will often heat up a reaction to make it happen. So what's going on there is we know at a higher temperature, the molecules in a solution or anything are moving faster. And so when they're moving faster, it's more likely that they're going to bump into each other more frequently and also harder, and that makes it more likely that the reaction will happen. So higher temperatures, the reaction happens faster. And another property of solutions is that adding solute to the solvent will increase the density. So this seems pretty common sense. So if I have salt and I add 1 cup versus 3 cups, the 3-cup solution of salt will be more dense than the 1-cup solution because it has more solutes in it. Another property of solutions is that adding solute to solvent will lower the freezing point. This is called freezing point depression. And this happens because we know, let's say for water, so when any solvent freezes, it has to make a crystalline structure. So for water, where those molecules are touching but they're moving around each other, what they need to do is they need to stop and make crystalline structure, make hydrogen bonds, and freeze in place. Whereas if we have random solutes in there, it makes it harder for the water molecules to make that ordered crystalline structure. So there are applications of this. So we know if it is winter out, we will add salt to the roads, which will decrease the freezing point, so it's less likely that ice will form on the roads, and it keeps our winter driving safer. Coming back to this, one interesting thing is it doesn't actually matter which solute you're adding. The concentration of the solute, not the solute itself, is the important thing. Interestingly enough, the boiling point is the opposite. So adding solutes will lower the freezing point, but adding solvents also increases the boiling point. So when we add salt to water, it will boil at a higher temperature than just if we have regular water. So that might be something to keep in mind if you're making pasta. It's probably a good idea to boil it first and then add your salt. So what's happening is we know when water and any solvent boils, it has to go from the liquid stage to the gas stage, and there are little molecules on the surface of the liquid that a molecule from above, when it has enough energy and speed, the little molecules are moving faster, and it bumps one of these molecules and gives it enough energy to go into the vapor phase. And when we add solutes, there are just more solutes at the surface and less water molecules at the surface. So it's less likely that it'll hit a water molecule and send it off than maybe sometimes it'll hit a salt molecule and send it off, but salt doesn't go into the vapor phase, so it just hits the salt molecule and doesn't send anything into the vapor phase. So it takes a little bit more energy, things have to be a little bit hotter, molecules have to be moving a little bit faster to get the water with a solute, like salt water, to boil compared to just pure water. Those are some important properties of solutions. 1, higher concentrations have faster reaction rates. 2, higher temperatures have faster reaction rates. 3, adding solute to solvent will increase the density. 4, adding solute to solvent will lower the freezing point. And 5, adding solute to solvent will increase the boiling point. And I believe I said this right, adding solute to solvent will lower the freezing point, but if not, it's lower. So moving on to electrolytes, and this is something we should be familiar with, particularly from they're important in human biology. Way more important than they are found in Gatorade is that they keep your body alive. Electrolytes are solutes that will conduct electricity when dissolved in water. So some really important ones in your body are sodium, potassium, and calcium. So sodium potassium pumps are used all over the place in cells. Some of the important ones are they are involved with nerve signals to send a nerve signal down a neuron, and that happens every time anything in your body happens. So there were sodium potassium pumps involved in telling my fingers to go like this, and also for the words to come out of my mouth. So there's a lot going on. Calcium ions are not just sitting in your bones, they're very important for muscle contractions. So anytime your muscle contracts, then calcium ions were involved. So electrolytes, they will conduct electricity when dissolved in water, and they are very important in your body. Another important property of aqueous solutions is that ionic compounds dissociate into ions when they dissolve. So they don't just dissolve, they don't just get mixed up into the water, they actually break apart, dissociate. So let's look at an example. So we have 2 ionic compounds, potassium chloride and silver nitrate. And as you can see from this chemical reaction, they are dissolved because they're aqueous. And that will result in a chemical reaction of, it's a double replacement, potassium nitrate and silver chloride. And it's also, if we notice, here's a precipitate. But what actually happens in this is, and please write this one down, potassium and chlorine break apart into separate ions. So you have a potassium ion that's aqueous and a chloride ion that's aqueous. And then silver nitrate dissociates into its ions, silver ion and nitrate ion, which we can see is aqueous. And again, then once the chemical reaction occurs, potassium nitrate breaks up into its ions. It dissociates potassium and nitrate. Whereas we can see that the silver chloride is not dissolved. It is a precipitate. It is insoluble. So it just stays together in the solid phase. So then we often talk about spectator ions in chemistry. These are ions that aren't involved in the reaction. So my question for you is, given all of these ions, which ones are the spectator ions? If you had said potassium and nitrate, you would be correct, because you can see potassium, it is not involved in the reaction, and nitrate over on the reactant side and nitrate on the product side, it is not involved in the reaction, but you can see that silver and chloride are involved in the reaction. So we would rewrite this in what we call a net ionic equation, which only shows the ions that are actually reacted. So our chloride aqueous ion and our silver aqueous ion react to form silver chloride, which is a precipitate in the solid phase. Let's take a moment and talk about dissolving versus dissociation. So I think it's best seen with some diagrams. What I think we're going to do is finish up our notes and then look at these simulations. So the last part of chapter 9 is chemistry, ancient oceans, and early life. So question from the reading is, how could living organisms form in ocean water? So there is a famous experiment. Miller and Urey did an experiment where they had simulated early early oceans, early Earth. So we know that water is a great solvent, and so it'd have a lot of minerals and elements dissolved in it. And then the atmosphere was high in methane and ammonia and hydrogen. So they put that in a flask and then they shot it with some electricity, which would simulate lightning. And lightning was also something that happened in early Earth, and meteorites. So Earth was being bombarded by meteorites. And what happened is those elements formed amino acids, lipids, and sugars, and we know that those are the organic molecules that are the building blocks for life. It's not mentioned in the book, but we also know that lipids will self-aggregate in kind of like a sphere. So that if you get some amino acids and sugars and lipids, and then the lipid forms kind of like a really rudimentary cell membrane, you have the building blocks for life. I thought that was pretty interesting. Another question is, what do blood and ocean water have in common according to your reading? Interestingly, blood plasma is very similar to ocean water. So all the dissolved ions and salts, the concentration of them is similar to ocean water. And one interesting thought is, so life originated in the oceans, and so if you had a single-celled organism, it would need to maintain an isotonic environment, which means the salt concentration would have to be the same on the outside as on the inside so that it didn't shrivel and die or burst and die. So it is thought that our cells, so blood plasma is the same ion concentration as extracellular fluid, which kind of bathes our cells. And so it's thought that our cells developed in ocean water, and then they need that same solute concentration, ion concentration, salt concentration, and so our blood plasma and our extracellular fluid are similar to ocean water to give them that. So another thing I want you to think about is the chemistry of ancient oceans. We know that ancient oceans had high levels of iron, and it's also very interesting that nearly all living organisms require iron. For example, humans, we know, have hemoglobin, which uses iron, and that's how it's in our erythrocytes, our red blood cells, and that's how we transport oxygen. Life evolved in early oceans when iron was really abundant, so it was like, great, let's use this. Interestingly enough, iron is not abundant in oceans today. We know that some of the earliest life forms were blue-green algae and cyanobacteria, which could photosynthesize, which produced oxygen. So as these early organisms were producing oxygen, and we know that early Earth had very low levels of atmospheric oxygen, but as these early organisms were producing oxygen, they were actually changing their environment. Once the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere and the water, because oxygen will dissolve a little bit in water, became high enough, what do we know about oxygen and iron? Well, it'll form rust, and so then that will precipitate out. Basically, 1.8 billion years ago, the oxygen levels became high enough that all of the iron reacted with the oxygen and precipitated out, and all of the iron mining, all of the iron used for steel, all comes from this one time in Earth's strata 1.8 billion years ago. So any of the iron mining to make steel, they have to dig into a layer that's 1.8 billion years old to get iron. So I feel like that's really interesting. We're running a little short on time, so I will do a second video where we look at the simulations for dissociation and dissolving. All right, see you then. Bye.